Hello, you're listening once again to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Haldane. On this episode, I'm going to be speaking to English novelist Jonathan Coe about his new work of fiction, The Proof of My Innocence. Well, as I increasingly keep referring to on this series, long-time listeners will know that most of my guests are authors of non-fiction works, and very occasionally, very, very occasionally, we'll have an author of fiction joining us on the Booking Club, and that is one of those occasions. I am delighted to be joined by the English novelist of many a novel that I could name off the top of my head. I'm thinking of The Rotters Club, I'm thinking of What a Carve Up, Middle England, Bourneville, and his latest novel, the novel we're going to be talking about this evening, The Proof of My Innocence. He is Jonathan Coe. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining me here.
Fine, it's great to be here.
Tell us why you've chosen North Sea Fish on Lee Street, I believe, in Bloomsbury.
Yeah, North Sea Fish is a restaurant kind of 5 minutes walk from King's Cross St Pancras railway station and the British Library, and it sells fish and chips. I don't know what else it sells. I think there are other things on the menu, but like many an English person, I have a passion for fish and chips, which is increasingly difficult to satisfy in London. I did suggest the possibility of another place, which is called the Fishkotech, down opposite Waterloo Station, in SE1, but we've come here. I discovered this place, I don't know, probably about 10 years ago, when I was still using the British Library on a daily basis to write in. I write at home these days, but I always used to write publicly in the British Library because I liked the feeling of having students and researchers around me. I don't know why that feeling went away, but it did. Anyway, I used to come here with friends for fish and chips, and still do periodically.
I must have discovered it even earlier than you, because when I came to university first in 2006, I was based just there. I'm pointing with my left hand for the benefit of listeners to the student accommodation right next to us. And This was my local chippy, and it was fantastic. And as you say, you know, London fish and chips has had a long reputation for being pretty poor, compared to the national average. I also think that it's not just a fish and chip restaurant, is it? If we look down here, they've got a placemat, which is quite an exotic variety of fish native to these shores. Halibut here, lemon sole, tuna, rainbow trout, sea bass, Dover sole. So there's quite a lot.
Are these all on the menu?
I believe they are, yeah. I mean, I think I'll be going for something pretty run-of-the-mill because, like you, I have a passion for fish and chips. It might just be a battered haddock for me with various accoutrements.
List of champagnes here as well, which is champagne and fish and chips, my ideal dinner, really. The very definition of a champagne socialist.
Well, there's still celebrations to be had over the subject of this conversation. I've read at least one of your other novels, Middle England. I read that, I think, in 2019 when it came out. Loved it. Felt that it captured the feeling of the country around the time of the coalition. I distinctly remember you writing satirically, and you are a satirical novelist above all, about the hype cycle around the banter between Nick Clegg and David Cameron, and how this was meant to save the country post-financial crisis. You know, the ridiculous delusions and myths that we create in times of national uncertainty, which you've always tracked, and which you track again.
They did a press conference in the Downing Street Rose Garden, didn't they? And were joshing and bantering, as you say, precisely because they were two posh public schoolboys, basically, who'd probably known each other for about 20 years.
Exactly.
It was a classic demonstration of how things work in
Absolutely.
this country.
And Middle England is a novel about Brexit. This is about something else. Perhaps I'll leave you to tell us what The Proof of My Innocence deals with. Published this year, bear in mind. So where does that bring us up to in terms of political events, Jonathan?
Well, I've given half a dozen or so interviews about this book in the last couple of weeks, and done public events about it as well, bookshop events. And what that's taught me is it's an incredibly difficult book to encapsulate in a few sentences. which I had no idea about really when I was planning it. I mean, the initial idea was to write a murder mystery, so that's the bottom line of what this book is. I'd recently become aware that a genre known as cozy crime was extremely popular in Britain, and I was kind of fascinated by this genre for the way that it combines the violent death of a human being, or more than one human being, with everything we associate with British tweeness and quaintness, thatched cottages, ivy-coloured vicarages. There's one called Murder at Evensong, I think, by Richard Coles. An eccentric old lady detective. It all goes back to Miss Marple and Agatha Christie and St Mary Mead, obviously. Anyway, as well as on one level finding this faintly ridiculous genre, I also find it a really attractive genre as a reader and as a writer. So I thought I would write a cozy crime. And parallel to that, sometime in 2022, I guess it was, the more hardline elements of the Conservative Party in this country, the Conservative movement, I should say, held a conference called the NatCon Conference, where all the columnists and writers, thinkers, politicians you would expect got together to debate the future of conservatism. And I just thought that, maybe not particularly cozy, but it would be a great enclosed, self-contained setting for a murder mystery. So that was the original idea, a murder mystery set at a conservative conference. Because I guess politically what I wanted to deal with in this book was how it seems to me that the Conservative movement and the Conservative Party in particular in this country has radicalised and moved to the right. I guess gradually over the last few decades, but exponentially after the Brexit referendum of 2016. And some of that pressure, some of that rightwards pressure, I think, has come from American conservatism and from how Republicans have moved rightwards since, the Tea Party days. And, and here we are with a second Trump presidency, and, in some ways the novel feels more kind of topical than I would have liked it to do.
It certainly feels even more topical since last week. Talking to a novelist about their fictional works on a podcast like this comes with the risk of peppering the conversation with spoilers if we refer to plot. Fortunately, because you're a satirical novelist, we can just talk about the politics and leave the story for those who are interested in the politics to find out for themselves. One thing I noticed here is that you were seemingly fascinated with, as you say, the rightward drift of the Conservative Party, but not only that, the way in which a lot of that rightward drift has maintained its affiliation and belief in old conservative values, even while it conserves less and less. And I thought that was interesting too. I mean, again, anyone like myself who follows politics will read of the characters that you write into this novel and think, that's him, that's her, I know who he's referring to there, that's Roger Scruton, etc., etc. Let's talk about how you assess the way that conservatism has become so warped and why you wanted to tackle it in this novel.
Well, I didn't take much notice of politics when I was growing up. It was in the air around me, but as a teenager I was far more focused on books and films and music and absorbing the kind of cultural influences that have formed me as a writer. And I guess the wake-up call for me at the age of what was I? I wasn't quite 18 because I wasn't quite old enough to vote, but it was May 1979 in the election of Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister for her first term. And up until that point, I'd kind of grown up with and accepted the myth, or perhaps that's too loaded a word, the story of the good conservative. My dad was conservative with a small c and with a big C. Always voted for Edward Heath as for as long as I was aware. My mum was very conservative in her kind of general value system. We took 2 newspapers during the 1970s. I remember the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. So there was the political bias of what was coming through our letterbox every morning was pretty significant. And I guess what I assumed back then was that whatever your political disagreements with it, conservatism was essentially a benign movement because it believed in conserving things. And, I grew up in an age where the great British institutions were the kind of bedrock of the national life, the BBC in particular, National Trust, even the NHS, really, which in the age of the post-war consensus was as highly valued by the Tories as by Labour, I think. And, what strikes me now is how viciously and how consistently some, very prominent, very important members of the Conservative Party attack those institutions. And this is a novel, in part, about the stories we all tell ourselves. The narrator of the book is an aspiring writer, and the story unfolds as 3 examples of her attempts to write her own novel, 3 consecutive examples. And I think Conservatives have started to tell a strange story about themselves in the last few years, which is to do with kind of victimhood and persecution. And, there's the story they told, I think, in the run-up to this year's election was one of having been in government but not in power. And having, how do you account for the fact that you've been in power for 14 years and the country is really pissed off and wants to get rid of you? You don't say that we had every opportunity and we did everything wrong. We say, well, we would have governed in the national interest, but we were thwarted at every turn by the media, by academia, by the judiciary, by the blob, in fact.
Chai latte drinking wokarati.
The chai latte drinking, the tofu eating wokarati.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Of the Conservatives that I've met and spoken to and even interviewed over the last few years, I've noticed too that there are some, as I see it, who very much sort of adhere to the Burkean strain of conservatism and who find themselves very much in opposition to what we've seen on the cabinet of most Conservative governments so far this century. The libertarian, small state Conservatives, for whom conservatism is really about thwarting the left as much as possible, thwarting the libs as much as possible,
yeah.
and in particular standing up for both free market capitalism but also standing against anything that smacks of kind of social progression beyond what they consider reasonable bounds. But they don't acknowledge what those conservatives I've spoken to do, which is that conservatism is a philosophy based on a duty of care. That there is a custodialism that is required in order for conservatism to fulfill its promise.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of the blueprint, really, for the explicit blueprint for the kind of small state libertarian conservatism that you were just talking about, is that book published in 2013, I think, co-authored by Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, 2 others whose names momentarily escape me, called Britannia Unchained. And, this book attracted a bit of attention at the time, got a few reviews. People were a little bit alarmed by it, I think, because it seemed to represent a possible direction for the Tory party, which was quite alarming, quite radical to many people. But it was a kind of fringe publication, and it came and went. But then suddenly in 2022, 2 of its authors were occupying the great offices of state, and you had Liz Truss as Prime Minister and Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor of the Exchequer. So suddenly there was a chance that this was actually going to happen, that this was actually going to be implemented. And, of course, they did attempt to implement a lot of what was in that book in the mini-budget of the autumn of 2022, and the results were there for everyone to see. the economy kind of crashed. First, Kwasi Kwarteng had to resign, then Liz Truss had to resign. But still, in fact, the story that she tells about that episode is that she was right, and it would have worked, but she was thwarted by the woke financial establishment.
If it weren't for those meddling kids.
Exactly.
I want to use this conversation to understand more the motivations of a satirical novelist, but specifically yourself. Having read your works before, I sometimes assume that a novel starts with you feeling this burning anger about a situation and then deciding, I'm going to write a novel that's going to expose the fuckers.
Yeah.
And that you sit down and you decide, I'm going to write something that ridicules them all, that shows them all up, and people will read it and celebrate it and say, he got it right, that's them, that's the situation we're in. Is that right?
The anger is there, and it's an important fuel, really, to the creative engine, but it's not the destination. Maybe it used to be in my earlier books. I think the kind of thought process you've just described is a good description of how I wrote What a Carve Up, which is a book I wrote 30 years ago now. Wrote it more than 30 years ago. It was published 30 years ago.
Specifically about the Thatcher years.
Specifically about the 1980s
yeah.
and the Thatcher years. And I guess we have to define our terms at this point and define the word satire in particular. And the definition I always come back to, or phrase I always come back to, is a phrase that Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, used about satire, which is that he describes it as a thesis art. So you have your thesis, you have your position, and that is the end point of the novel, and the purpose of the novel is to take the reader to that position, really, to prove your point, in a word. And a thesis novel, he said, always ends with a feeling of QED. So I think that's a good description of What a Carve Up, and I'm happy to have What a Carve Up described as a satiric novel. I don't really think I do that anymore. And I think the turning point, in a way, was Middle England, which I began writing in early 2016, before the Brexit referendum, but the Brexit campaign was underway, and that kind of nasty polarisation sort of came to dominate British political conversation in a way that it hadn't really before in my experience. And among the many other things I felt waking up the morning after the referendum result was announced was stupidity, really, because I hadn't seen it coming. I knew it was going to be close. Everything indicated that it was going to be close, but I just hadn't realised how strong people's feelings ran, not on this subject, because I don't think people's feelings ever really ran that strongly on whether we belong to the European Union or not. Not most people's. But the feelings stirred up very expertly by the likes of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage during the referendum campaign were strong.
You say you felt that the stupidity was yours to own because of the result. Does a satirical novelist naturally put pressure on themselves to predict things?
Not to predict things, but to understand things, I think.
As they're happening?
Yes. And I woke up that morning thinking, wow, I don't understand my country nearly as well as I thought I did. So it was a kind of wake-up call, and the same for many on the liberal left, I think. So the writing of Middle England was kind of diametrically opposed to the writing of What a Carve Up. With What a Carve Up, I began with a feeling, I hate Thatcherism, I'm angry about what's happened to the country in the last 11 years, I'm going to write a book about it, and I'm going to try and make the reader feel the same way.
And by the way, how old were you when you wrote What a Carve Up?
When I started it, I was about 28, 29.
A ripe age to write a satirical novel.
Also the right age to write a satirical novel, yes. With Middle England, it was the opposite of that. I began by thinking, okay, I don't really know what's going on here. Consciously going to write from the point of view of characters on both sides of the argument. I'm going to try to vocalize and dramatize the arguments on both sides as empathetically as possible, and see where that gets me. And it's still it still got me to the point at which many people see Middle England as being an anti-Brexit novel and a pro-Remain novel, which is fine because that is my point of view, and that is what I consider to be the truth about Brexit, that it was a terrible idea. But it does so in a much more polyphonic and a much more, in a way in which the different perspectives, political, ideological, personal, are much more in a dialogue with each other than they ever were in What a Carver. And I think that makes it more of a novel and less of a satire.
I see, okay.
So what I think, since we're trying to be precise about terms here, because often, in a conversation with a journalist, I'm quite happy to throw words like satire around, but now I would say what I'm writing are novels about politics with a strong element of comedy. But that doesn't necessarily make them satirical, because they're not thesis novels.
True. I think, if anything, the satire that does exist in The Proof of My Innocence really comes out through the dialogue.
Yes.
Because that's where you get the clash of ideas, isn't it?
Yeah. There are moments of satire, there are elements of satire. But the overall tendency of the book is not satirical, I don't think.
Listeners wouldn't know it, but we've actually ordered, in the process of just talking, I've developed telepathic abilities. No, but what have we ordered? I went for a medium haddock and chips, and you,
I've
Jonathan?
gone for a medium cod and chips.
Lovely.
Pretty straight down the line orders, really. We're not pushing the boat out here.
It occurs to me to ask about the habits, the protocol, perhaps, of basing characters on real people. I wondered who in this book might be based on a real person besides the obvious. Prue Freeborn, she's the detective at the centre of the murder mystery. Could it be that there's maybe some element of truth to who lies behind that particular character persona?
I won't tell you who it is, because it is a real person, and she's a very good friend of mine. And I told her over dinner that the detective in my new novel was based on her, and was she happy with that? And she was very happy with it, and is very happy with the way I've portrayed her, I'm pleased to say. But that's a very rare instance, actually, of taking somebody directly from real life. This person, anyway, is a kind of larger-than-life character, and kind of could be placed in a slightly over-the-top satirical setting quite kind of comfortably. So that makes it a sort of unusual instance. I mean, at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have Phyl, who is the narrator of a lot of the book. She's a young woman of 22 or 23. She's just graduated from university. She's back at home with her parents. Doesn't know what to do with her life. The whole university experience seems to have gone by in the blink of an eye without solving any of her kind of life problems. And there we have a character where the situation that she initially finds herself in is very much based on a real moment, which is the moment when my own younger daughter came back from university in the summer of 2022. But the moment I'd thought up Phyl and put her in that situation, I took her in a completely different direction and made her an aspiring writer. And
not easy years to be at university.
Terrible years to be at university because, COVID completely
nuked it. Really.
Nuked that experience for her and all her friends. So, that's two kind of extremes, really, of the way you can take a character from real life and put them into a fictional situation. And most of the characterizations in my book lie somewhere in between.
Do you take any pleasure whatsoever in readers of your works who come up to you and say, "You're so right, you're so right"? Does a satirical novelist or anyone who attempts satire in fiction seek to be right? Is that the goal? Or do you much prefer it if they just came along and said, "I laughed my arse off, thank you"? Is there vindication you're seeking?
Well, all writers are seeking vindication, I think, and all praise is welcome, even misplaced praise. We'll take it, basically.
Yes.
And I do get it.
Indeed, across borders too. I think you were the last British novelist, were you not, to receive the European Book Prize?
I did receive the European Book Prize. I don't know whether anyone else from this country has received it since then. We can't because we're not members of the EU. You have to be a member of an EU country. So yes, that's true. Yeah. That's true. There's a line in the novel, a line of dialogue, spoken by a character, and in my mind, very, very clearly, I made this out to be a stupid character, and I made him say a particularly stupid and banal thing. And yet a reader came out to me recently and said, I love that line. I really thought about that line. I kind of so agreed with it. It really made me think. And, fine, maybe I was wrong about it. Maybe I inadvertently put a pearl of wisdom into this character's voice.
The food has arrived, glistening in a thin layer of grease on a very crispy batter. Let's begin.
That's one incredible gherkin that you've got there. It's the biggest gherkin I've ever seen.
Yes.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Right, Jonathan, your review. Marks out of 10 for that.
A solid 9, I think. In fact, I don't even know why I've knocked one off. Maybe the portions weren't quite as outrageously generous as you'd get in some fish and chip shops out of town, I think. Maybe that's my only my only comment.
Although let's not forget the refillable baskets of chips.
Refillable baskets of chips, yep. Pickled onions, which you didn't even ask for.
No, that's right.
Anyway.
They just came anyway, complimentary. Of fish and chip shops across the country, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? They're different almost everywhere. Pea wet, I've never tried yet. Have you ever tried this?
Pea wet, I haven't even heard of that.
Pea wet is the runoff of mushy peas. The sort of pea soup, and is used as a sort of seasoning, a lashing, a kind of gravy.
Yeah.
I've not yet tried it, but it's a northern thing. I think in Manchester they do it. I might be wrong about that.
Fish and chips are very chic in Paris at the moment, or maybe that was a few years ago, and the fad has passed now. But I was actually doing publicity interviews for one of my books. I think it was Middle England, and the journalist kept asking me questions about fish and chips and had I tried the Parisian version, etc., etc., which I did do in the end, and it was very disappointing. It was far too, there was a highly flavoured sauce poured over the wafer-thin French fries and this kind of stuff. It was served in a bowl.
Yes.
I said, no, this is not how you do it at all.
No, instantly, not the same.
Fry the fish, fry the chips, put them side by side on a plate.
Yeah.
Your job's done.
Exactly. Very functional, isn't it? The Anglo approach. We've been speaking throughout the evening about the due diligence, in some respects, of a novelist, in particular a satirical novelist who is trying to get across what's going on and convey it faithfully and accurately, though not necessarily wanting always to be right about the situation, but wanting it to be recognisable and to resonate. And you do this in many ways in all of your work, but I noticed also that as a writer you're staying up to date with life writing or autofiction. It's a nice nod that you give to sort of the new generation of fiction writers. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Autofiction is not really a new form, but it seems to have gone mainstream in the last few years in a way which wasn't really the case before. In a way, I'm kind of less interested in the form itself than by the claims that people make for it, either implicitly or explicitly. 20 years ago, I published a biography of a British writer of the 1960s called B.S. Johnson, who was best remembered at the time when I was writing about him as an experimentalist who played kind of ingenious formal games with the novel as an object, like the famous book in a box with unbound chapters which you can shuffle and read in any order. But since, in the 20 years since finishing that book, what I've become more interested about in him is the fact that he was not calling it autofiction, but definitely writing autofiction in the 1960s. And he wrote a number of essays where he insisted, for instance, that novel and fiction were not synonymous terms. And that what he was doing, this is the phrase that I always remembered, what he was trying to do was write the truth in the form of a novel. And he meant truth very, very literally. He meant I'm just writing about the things that have happened to me and the people that I know. I'm going to use the same names. I'm not going to change anything about it at all. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking to you about earlier when I said that this kind of writing seems to me to occupy a very problematic grey area, because he published these non-fiction novels like Trawl and The Unfortunates, which are marvellous books. Very moving, very involving, but we have no idea how true they are, really. We only have his word for that. He could be making any of it up. Whereas, as I've said before, there's a purity to me in the contract between the reader and writer of fiction. The ground is cleared. You don't have to worry about what's true and what isn't true, because you know that none of it is true. Johnson became very militant when he was arguing for his brand of autofiction. He took a very moral position and put himself on a kind of moral high ground, really, and said that I'm telling the truth, these other novelists are all telling lies, they're pulling a fast one on you, and I'm not. And I hear that slightly evangelical note behind many of today's writers of autofiction. You know, the kind of implied assumption that there's something fake, maybe even a little juvenile, about making up stories, making up characters, putting words into characters' mouths. But I love it, and the more I write, the more I like fictionality and plot and structure and contrivance. I mean, you have to do all these things very carefully so that there's a sheen of plausibility over the story that you're telling. But a novel is a kind of musical box to me. It's a clockwork mechanism, and you don't necessarily want the reader to see the workings, but what emerges, what comes out on top, can be absolutely beautiful.
And this novel is a musical box, a box of tricks.
A box of tricks. That's a good expression. Yeah,
particularly a musical box if you're a fan of Bob Dylan.
I'd forgotten until I have some pretty big cultural blind spots. Martin Amis is one of them. Bob Dylan is another.
Oh, really?
Apparently the structure or the melody of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall comes from this folk song that I've quoted in The Proof of My Innocence, Lord Randall.
Yeah, the conceit or motif does. And then Bob Dylan brilliantly modernises it with a very anthemic verse that leads to that chorus, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall.
Yeah. That didn't occur to me when I heard this song, which was about 7 or 8 years ago, probably, on Radio 3, that was just on in the background, and I heard this very eerie, very haunting melody sung by a countertenor, and I listened to the song again on BBC Sounds and tried to attend to the lyrics and realised that they were slightly strange and macabre and were about a case of poisoning, a case of murder, basically, and a romantic betrayal, and a slightly unhealthy relationship between a man and his mother. And I just tucked it away at the back of my mind and thought, that song is going to come in useful to me one day. I know it will. So when I needed a song for Peter Cockerell, the fictional novelist in my book, to be obsessed with, obsessed to the extent that he sings it in his sleep, I knew that this was going to be the one to use.
I think it's fair to say that we've said next to bugger all about the plot, which is just as well, and was my intention. We've talked about everything except. If you want to really know what happens in this book, we've referred to characters, we've referred to ideas, we've referred to little details here and there. You're going to have to pick it up and read it yourself. Thank you very much once again for joining me on the Booking Club. Jonathan Coe.
Thank you. Thanks.